Okay, so what I'm gonna put in the chat, I sent out an email to some of the PC folks yesterday. It's our offer practice summary. But I will also,
Yeah, I looked at that.
you have it? Okay, perfect. So what I'm just gonna do is I'll share my screen.
Okay.
Okay, so this is gonna be our subject property and some buyer background for our offer. But we're gonna be looking at 10537 West Wisconsin Avenue in Tosa. So I'm just gonna quickly look at that. Can you still see my MLS screen?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So here's what we got. It's a 3-bed, 2.5 bath, single family home in Wauwatosa. Asking price or list price is 449.9. Went on the market, I think just before the weekend. But just some things that I always look to right away when I'm looking at an MLS listing sheet are some of the exclusions, inclusions, and primary remarks. So or private remarks, excuse me. So in private remarks, it's indicating that we should contact Say, who's the listing agent. Seller's asking for 48 hours binding acceptance, reserves the right to accept an offer at any time. Seller's looking for a quick closing. And then it appears that some digital photos of the exterior have been enhanced. And then the standard room size is not verified. And then surprisingly, the front door has never been used and there's no key.
Yeah, I was like,
So
wow.
I think we probably would have seen that if we would
Oh,
have actually gone to see the house in person.
uh-huh.
So in terms of inclusions and exclusions, they've got a lot of the typical appliances that are included. So dishwasher, oven range, fridge, washer and dryer. But then they actually have some personal items that they are willing to include. And then there's also a list of exclusions, seller's personal property, staging items. And then again, a couple of things if people are interested in adding the wardrobe and dresser, negotiable and a bill of sale. So the first thing too that I also take a look at is I go into the document section. We've got a condition report. We have a lead paint, we've got some FAQs, and then an amendment to the record. So understanding the date that the condition report was filled out is important because we're going to need to know that for our offer. So here it says December 24th, 2024. So I would save that to my desktop because I would have to upload it into zip forms to get that signed by the buyer. But then it looks too like there's an amendment. And the amendment indicates that the wrong date was inadvertently entered in the condition report regarding the kitchen remodel. Okay, so that's not a big deal. But your buyer would have to sign that as well. And then really what I'm very interested in is to see what some of the FAQs are. And this is a wonderful summary that Say has put together, the listing agent, as it pertains to utilities, how old some of the appliances are, and then some updates that the seller has made over time in terms of roof, driveway, basement items, kitchen, etc. So sometimes too in these FAQs, there might be some very specific instructions that we need to follow for writing an offer. And here it really the only one here is just sending all offers as one PDF to Say. And you'll notice that when we get into MLS, the listing agent is indicated as Say, but the email is actually Amanda Schroeder's email, who is the team rainmaker. So it's good that we check this out because we want to be making sure we send this to the right person.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go back to our offer document. Our buyer here is Matt LaFleur, and he signed a buyer agency with us last week. So in that buyer agency, he agreed to 2.4% compensation, and our buyer agency agreement is valid for 60 days. So he therefore is a client of ours and not a customer. He's got a budget of up to 500,000 and a flexible closing time frame, but actually wants to get in sooner versus later, and does want to have a home inspection and a radon inspection. He's pre-approved for up to 525 with a lender for a 30-year mortgage. He's planning on putting 15% down, and we're going to use a 7% interest rate.
Okay.
Now, one thing that I always do too, if I'm gonna be submitting an offer on behalf of my clients, I will give the listing agent a call just to see if there's any other information that I can get from that agent pertaining to seller preferences, like closing time frame, if they need post-closing occupancy. So I always pick up the phone and let them know that I'm gonna be submitting an offer, but if there's anything else that might be important for me to know, this is a great time to share that. And after talking with Say, I asked if the seller was offering buyer's agents compensation. And she said, yes, they're offering cooperative compensation of 2%.
Okay.
So we've signed a buyer agency with Matt. And in that, we have agreed to a 2.4% commission of the total purchase price in that buyer agency agreement. So we do have a little bit of a gap here.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of different ways that you could resolve this. One is amending your buyer agency agreement to 2% just for this address. If you're willing to go down on your commission, you could try to write 2.4% into the offer to get your full commission. The seller might accept it, the seller might counter and remove it. That's an option. You could also ask for closing cost credits, or you could just have the conversation as you should with the buyer, giving them the update as to like what the seller is willing to do. And if your buyer is willing to pick up the difference, then that difference would be paid for by the buyer at the time of close. So we're just going to pretend that that's the case. Like we know Matt LaFleur's got some cha-ching. And he's willing to, he sees the value that you're providing and he is willing to pay that difference of 0.4% in the commission. So at that point, we don't have to do anything different to our offer.
Okay.
The instructions that we're going to follow to draft the offer are as follows. So the asking price is $499.9. Let's just pretend we're in a little bit of competition and Matt's willing to offer $477.5. So 27.5 over. This isn't necessarily competitive offer practice, but it's just the amount that we're gonna use. He's interested from an inclusions perspective and everything that MLS listed for the mechanicals and the appliances, but he doesn't want that primary bed and bed frame, and he doesn't want the TV.
Mm-hmm.
The exclusions, fine, okay with what was in MLS, but again, he doesn't want any of those personal items. So we'll make sure that we take care of that in the offer and specify what we want and what we don't want. The seller wanted a fast closing date, and we knew Matt was pretty flexible. So we're gonna ask for a closing date of February 4th. So it's give or take 28-ish days, which is totally feasible. But keep that deadline in mind or that closing date in mind because we'll want to make sure that our contingencies that have deadlines fall within that shortened closing time frame. Earnest money, he's willing to give 2% of the purchase price. Usually earnest money in our market currently is anywhere between 1 to 3% of the purchase price. A buyer can always offer more than that, but this is somewhat typical for our market. And then the following contingencies, he wants to make sure that we do include the home inspection, and he wants that radon test. He'll give the seller the right to cure. And he is willing to cover up to the first $1,000 in inspection repairs. So that means we're going to want to be adding addendum AC to our offer. So you'll see that later.
Okay.
The financing terms are stated above. So 15% down, a 7% interest rate. And he'd like the appraisal contingency included in giving the seller the right to cure. So I always put in here too, like make sure you pay attention to any private remarks that the listing agent has included. So we know that the seller wanted 48 hours binding acceptance. We also know based on one of those documents that Say had uploaded into MLS that all offers should be sent to her.
Mm-hmm.
And then she also said it's easiest if we add in our compensation directly to the offer versus signing a compensation agreement. So again, just a note, we talked a little bit about it before, because there is a gap between what the seller was willing to cover and what our agency agreement is for. It's just really important that you have those conversations with your buyers to figure out how you want to address that gap, whether it's in the offer or whether it's not. So I'm going to go right into the offer itself. So I've already filled in a offer document, and I don't know why it's not showing in the order.
So are people usually using compensation agreements now instead of just putting it in the offer to purchase?
It really depends on the listing agent.
Okay.
We, KW, we were preferring that agents leverage the compensation agreement prior to submitting the offer. So getting that in, both agents sign it, and then you don't
Mhm.
have to put it into the offer document itself.
Okay.
But some listing agents might not have the time or be able to get over a compensation agreement to you quickly to sign. So in that
Mhm.
case, a lot of times people are just saying, just write it into the offer.
Okay.
But for our practice today, we are going to write it into the offer so you can see how that would be done.
Okay.
So I've listed here, I've already filled in the offer document. So this is kind of our answer key. So I put in today's date, January
Mhm.
7th, because Matt signed a buyer agency agreement with us that makes him, in fact, an agent of or a client of ours. So we are the agent of the buyer. I've crossed out agent of seller and listing firm. I've put his name here. I've typed in the address. In line 6, we have to list the municipality type. So it's in fact in the village of Wauwatosa. So that would be like village, city, town. If you're not quite sure with the municipality type, I'll quickly just go over to MLS. MLS will list it here for you in the detail sheet.
Okay.
You'll also need to put the county name next. And again, MLS has that right up here on top if you're not quite sure what county the property falls in. So we've got our address here. It's in the village of Wauwatosa, county of Milwaukee. I've typed in the offer price into line 410. And once you type in the numerical version, it'll write out 477,500 in the line above. And here's where I wanted to make sure we got very specific with how we were treating inclusion. So just because a seller is willing to offer an inclusion doesn't mean your buyer necessarily wants it. So we
Mhm.
knew that Matt wanted what was offered in MLS as it pertained to some of the mechanicals. I've got dishwasher, oven range, fridge, washer dryer, storage shelving in the basement, and then he does want the TV mount in the living room.
Okay.
What he didn't want was the seller's personal property. He didn't want the TV that was being offered. He did not want the primary bed and bed frame, and he's not going to have any of the staging furniture. So
Mhm.
now, if there are some things that Matt saw in the house that he wanted, you could always put them in there as inclusions. It's
Okay.
not, it's always worth a shot. But sometimes these are things that people like to go back and forth and encounter.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, if there are personal items like the bed, like the TV, those are things that really should be left out of the offer and put into a bill of sale that can be submitted along with the offer. And I think even say put something into MLS indicating such, like put it into a bill of sale.
Okay.
Lines 24 through 38 talk about what a fixture is. It's a definition. So anything that is really physically affixed to the property is technically an inclusion. So if there's ever any question or you're not quite sure as to whether or not something is included, like a bathroom mirror or a light fixture, technically those, if they're screwed into the wall, are, but sometimes sellers, take those things because maybe it's a family heirloom or they really like the mirror. So if there's ever a thing that you're questioning, ask the listing agent just to clarify or just put it into the offer itself.
Okay.
We know that the seller asked for 48 hours for binding acceptance. So that's what I've put here. So if we're drafting the offer today on January 7th, we'll give them until 11:59 p.m. on January 9th. Now, if we wanted the date or we wanted it to be due at noon on January 9th, you would just click in the box 12 p.m. and then the date. Otherwise, if you don't specify a time, it goes automatically through the very end of the day. Now,
Okay.
again, binding acceptance means an offer is valid if both parties have signed a copy and both parties are in receipt of a signed offer. That makes the offer binding. And that's what it says here. Acceptance occurs when all buyers and sellers have signed one copy of the offer. Now, in terms of closing, we indicated that we are looking to close on February 4th. Our documents, at least in the North Shore office, automatically populate with this language here at the place selected by the buyer, and that's pretty common. So if your market center, if your office doesn't have that automatically populated, you might have to type it in there. But then
Might
I've also then crossed out at a place selected by seller.
Okay. And do you just leave that in there unless they specifically put in MLS where they would want the closing or something?
Yeah, usually in our market, it's very typical for the buyer and the buyer's lender to select the location.
Okay.
Um, I think maybe back in the day, sellers were picking the place, but now with closings, a lot of times the sellers were pre-sign and the
Mm-hmm.
sellers don't even show up to closing. So it's becoming much more common just to indicate that the buyer is going to select the location.
Okay.
Now, moving on to page 2, make sure that the full address is at the very top of the subsequent pages. So I actually had to type in the remainder of the address, but if you need to type it in, you just click in here and you can automatically fill it in. But our earnest money, Matt was willing to offer 2% of the purchase price. So 2% of 477.5 is $9,550. And I've just indicated he's gonna have that delivered within 3 days. I like to make it as quick of a time frame as possible. Make sure that you remind your buyers that earnest money is deposited immediately. So if they are sending in a check or if they're using wire trust funds, wiring the money via MLS, that will hit their bank account immediately. So that cash needs to be on hand.
Okay.
So I've indicated that all money should be delivered to and held by the listing firm. I've crossed off drafting firm and other identified as. It's
Okay.
very typical for the listing firm to hold the earnest money. Now, there are some situations where an agent either prefers to maybe have a title company hold earnest money, or maybe the brokerage is a smaller brokerage and they leverage a title company to hold the money.
Mm-hmm.
Usually when that's the case, you will see those instructions in MLS. So if
Okay.
we were saying that Focus Title was going to be holding the money, I would change this, move it over, other identified as, and I would like put Focus Title and then the address.
Okay.
But we're not doing that today. We're just gonna have the listing firm hold it. So I'm gonna get rid of that, come back over here. Okay. And then this section here talks about how earnest money is dispersed if the transaction does not get to closing. So I'm not going to go through this. Make sure you do read the information as it pertains to disbursement. It's not necessarily always a given that the buyer gets their money back. It's not necessarily always a given that a seller gets to keep it. So just make sure you familiarize yourself with this language and that you communicate that also to your buyer so they're aware.
Okay.
The condition report, so sellers have to, by law, fill out and provide a condition report that is to the best of their knowledge as to what's happening in the home. There might be some situations where a seller doesn't fill out a condition report, such as if they've never lived in the property, maybe they're a personal representative for the seller, like a trust or an attorney. So if they are in one of those situations where they don't have to fill out the condition report, there's also a document that they do need to fill out indicating they are not required to provide one or they just refuse to provide one. But we know that our sellers provided a condition report. We looked at it very briefly at the beginning of the session. And the seller filled out the condition report back on Christmas Eve on December 24th. So I've just clicked in that, added the date. And by indicating the date that the condition report was filled out, you're just acknowledging, or your buyers are acknowledging, that they have in fact received a condition report. It doesn't mean that they necessarily agree with what's on the condition report, but they're just indicating that they have received a copy.
Okay. Do you ever do anything with the time is of the essence?
I haven't ever seen anything. That's a good
Okay.
question. So usually, you want to meet, each party is responsible for meeting the dates and deadlines that are outlined here in our documents. I've
Mhm.
never really seen anybody indicate other exceptions. Like,
Okay.
but deadline's a deadline. We want to make sure we match our deadlines.
Okay. Got it.
Page 3 is just, we don't have to really modify anything in here if we don't want to, because it's just a list of some of the things that a seller should be thinking about and disclosing on the condition report. But here we get to the top of page 4. And the first contingency right out of the gate is the home inspection. So we know that our buyer does in fact want to have a home inspection. So I've checked the box in line 193. Now, if for any reason a seller or a buyer doesn't want to include contingencies, instead of leaving this box blank, you would put NA, and you'll see that later. It's just best practice to put NA versus leaving it blank. But we know that Matt wants a home inspection. And the home inspection here, it really talks about what that is. It's a visual inspection of the property by a third-party licensed individual. The seller's giving the buyer permission to enter the premises. The buyer has to restore the property back to its original condition. But this is just something that you want to make sure that you walk through your buyers so they understand what in fact an inspection is, because it's different than a test. An inspection is a visible inspection, where a test actually takes something from the property, like soil, water, etc.
Mhm.
So checking the box here means that our offer is contingent upon a registered home inspector coming in and performing a home inspection of the property after the date of today's offer. So the inspection has to happen after today. Now, if there was a section of the house, maybe you knew from your showing that there appeared to be some basement issues, you could also write in here on lines 197, any other specific inspections that you want to have in addition to the general inspection. So you can kind of get those things taken care of right away. Otherwise, if you have your home inspection and the inspector puts in their report a recommendation to have a follow-up inspection by another party, like a chimney company, a roofer, a foundation, that's indicated here that the buyer does have the opportunity to have those follow-up inspections coming out of that report that the inspector put together.
Okay.
Buyer shall order the inspections and is responsible for paying for the inspections. Now, something to keep in mind, we talk about time here. Anything in bold is, something that the WRA wants us to make sure that we're paying attention to. Right here, caution, buyer should provide sufficient time for the home inspection and any other inspections. That is something that you need to be discussing with your buyer when you're drafting and coming up with your offer strategy. I've listed here that the contingency is going to be deemed satisfied the buyer within blank days after acceptance. I've set 8.
Mhm.
If you don't put anything in the line, it automatically defaults to 15 days. But I am saying that within 8 days, we're going to have the home inspection done. We're going to have any follow-up inspections done. And my goal too is to have any type of repairs, adjustments, what have you, figured out and negotiated and determined within these 8 days. This does not mean that I'm just going to have the home inspection done in 8 days. Everything needs to be wrapped up within 8 days.
Mhm.
So the contingency, I'm going to read it again. The contingency is deemed satisfied unless the buyer within 8 days after acceptance delivers to the seller a written inspection report dated after the date of today's offer and a written notice listing the defects identified in those reports to which the buyer objects. So when you get your home inspection report as the buyer's agent, you should be sending that over to the listing agent for them to review as well. So both parties should have that information, because if you are negotiating any type of repair, credit, price adjustment, it's only fair for both parties to have that same information. Now, say in those 8 days, maybe let's use the basement. The basement needed to be braced. It needed to have drain tile. Maybe once you got the basement guy in there, they said it was going to cost $15,000 to repair. And within those 8 days, you tried negotiating with the seller, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we want you to fix the basement prior to close. Or maybe it was Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we want you to cover $14,000 of the basement repair because we said we would cover the first 1,000. Well, if you guys can't come to any type of agreement or a signed amendment, and an amendment is signed by both parties that really specifies how things are going to be fixed or cured, then you really don't. And if your buyer is like, you know what, I can't take on the basement repair, like we're willing to walk if the seller's not going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we would deliver a notice objecting to all of the defects that were identified in that report. So this is where you really are not coming to any type of agreement. If you don't send that notice within 8 days, or if you don't have an amendment that resolves the things that you are asking for, and you just let the deadline pass, your buyer has just purchased the property as is, so they don't have any leverage. So it's really important that you maintain your dates and deadlines and understand how all of those things work.
So all negotiations have to be done within
Yep.
that.
Now
frame.
you can extend the deadline if you want to, or if both parties you're thinking like, okay, we just need a little bit more time, or maybe you need some more time to get a follow-up inspection done. You
Mhm.
can amend, you can send an amendment that would be signed by both parties indicating that the deadline gets moved to whatever day. But again, that's something that both parties have agreed to. I've seen situations where an amendment has been sent to the seller to extend the home inspection deadline and a seller's never sent it back. And the buyer's agent thinks, well, I sent the amendment to get it signed. So it's, we're going to extend the deadline. That's not the
Mhm.
case unless both parties sign that amendment to extend it. It's not extended.
Okay. Is there any like thing that looks really appealing with how long you have that
Mhm.
time? Like, is making it 8 like really appealing to the listing?
To the
Yeah.
seller, yeah. I think a seller would prefer clearly not to even have an inspection, but
Uh-huh.
the shorter time frame is always going to be more advantageous for a buyer to include because it looks better to the seller. Usually
Okay.
this time frame is the most stressful time frame for all parties involved.
Uh-huh.
Something to keep in mind though too, you want to make sure that your buyers are also going to be in town during this time frame because you're going to want them to go to the inspection and you're going to want to be able to get them engaged in conversations and be able to sign any documents.
Okay.
So in our market right now, it's still a seller's market and it's still very common for buyers to give the seller the right to cure. Okay.
Okay.
So every question that you might have about the offer, every answer is in the offer already. So it talks about how does a seller cure? The seller has the right to cure. They can satisfy the contingency by delivering a notice back to the buyer within 2 days after the buyer gave them the notice of defects, saying, yep, we're going to cure the defects. They have to cure the defects in a good and workmanlike manner, and they have to deliver to the buyer a written report detailing the work to be done no later than 3 days prior to closing. So that is if you didn't come to an agreement in an amendment, and in fact, your buyer has issued a notice of defect and said, okay, seller, here's everything that we want you to fix. Couldn't come to an agreement on the roof, so not only are we now asking you to fix the roof, but here's a bunch of other defects that we're asking you to fix. Seller can satisfy it by sending a notice back indicating, yep, we're gonna cure it. Then they cure it in good and workmanlike manner, and they have to send, again, 3 days prior to closing, a report detailing the work that was done. Now, that's only if the seller has the right to cure. But the offer is null and void if the buyer sends that notice of defect in the inspection report and the seller never had the right to cure to begin with. So if your buyer didn't give the seller the right to cure and they give a notice of defect, the deal is dead.
Okay.
Or the deal can be dead if the buyer sends a notice of defect and the seller sends back a notice indicating they're not going to cure. Or the deal is dead if your buyer has sent a notice and the seller never sends a notice back within the time frame that we've stated above.
Okay, so yeah, you want to factor these 2 days into the 8 days.
These are 2 days. So once maybe on day 8, yeah, on day 8, I've delivered a notice of defect to the seller.
Mm-hmm.
I am now giving the seller 2 days to determine what they're going to do. So 2 days beyond.
Oh, okay.
Now, maybe I delivered the notice of defect on day 5. I didn't even wait. Maybe there was, I knew that there was going to be no way that two parties were going to come together. I still would only give like 2 days
Okay.
because at this point, you should be having a lot of dialogue with the other party, and there shouldn't be a lot of surprises if this step is now being taken. So I don't give a seller 10 days to figure that out. Like, you
Mm-hmm.
should know. Then the radon test also follows, and this is, we're checking the box because the buyer wanted the radon test. The radon test also follows the same time frame typically as the home inspection. So if you recall, we gave ourselves 8 days up here in the home inspection to get that figured out. And we're going to give ourselves 8 days here for the radon test as well. A lot of home inspectors can also do radon testing at the same time as the home inspection. They'll leave a kit in the basement, and that kit stays there for, I think, 4 to 8 hours to take some readings throughout that time frame. And then the home inspector will go back and pick up the kit. The home inspector then will give a report back. And again, we want to get all of this figured out within 8 days. If it does come back that the radon level is over this 4 point picocuries, then we're giving the seller the right to cure the contingency.
Okay.
Now, one thing I want to point out, typically the buyer pays for the home inspection, and typically the buyer also pays for the radon test. So I'm just indicating such. It's going to be at the buyer's expense. So the right to cure language actually looks pretty similar for the radon test as it does for the home inspection contingency. But usually the right to cure, we in this market are giving it to the seller. And we also give the radon report, similar to how we would give the inspection report over to the seller. We give them a copy as well. And then to cure a radon contingency, if the levels come back high, we're asking the seller to put in a radon mitigation system right here, install that radon mitigation system. And that typically, just for your information, is anywhere between like $1,200 to like $1,700. And the seller would install that prior to closing. But it gives very specific steps here as to how the seller would cure. And then again, the language is very similar to the home inspection. The offer's dead if the seller never had the right to cure to begin with, or the seller decides that they don't want to cure it, or the seller never delivers in a timely manner that notice back. Moving into financing. So we have, oh, I'm sorry, there's a question. What would you do in that case if the seller doesn't sign the amendment to change the deadline and you need more time to complete inspections? this is a tough one because if the seller's really not signing the amendment, you need to do what is gonna be best for your buyer client. And that means, so let's use our 8-day example. That was our deadline. If it is 11 PM on day 8 and you don't have a signed amendment extending the home inspection contingency, and your buyers cannot buy that house the way it currently stands, you're most likely going to be sending a notice before 11:59 that night on day 8, indicating all of the defects. And then you're really putting it on the seller to determine what they're going to do. It's kind of the sooner you can get an amendment in front of both parties to extend any deadline, the better. I would never wait until the day of the home inspection contingency deadline to try to extend that amendment or try to extend that deadline. I would probably start doing it 2 to 3 days before. Because you're gonna know 2 or 3 days before if you need more time to get those follow-up inspections completed.
So when you're sending the notice of defects, are you at all saying, like, are you already negotiating what your buyer wants?
Yeah, so usually on the notice of defect, that is indicating your buyer is willing to walk if the seller doesn't fix everything that you've listed.
Okay.
So usually what happens is a buyer will not only include in that notice the defects that you were trying to negotiate. So let's use our roof example again. Maybe in the home inspection report, not only was there a roof situation, but maybe there were the water heater didn't have like an exit valve that it needed, and that's a defect. And maybe there was not a railing on the steps going down, up and down to the basement. That's a defect because it's a safety concern. But you never really talked about those things in your negotiations because your buyer was really prioritizing the basement.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times what happens is by issuing that notice to the seller, we're listing the basement, we're listing the arm rail, the handrail, and we're listing the water heater. And now the seller, he's got to fix all 3.
Okay, but he could also like negotiate within that or no? The seller?
No, at that point, like you're asking him to do all of it.
Okay.
That's where, if you get a notice of defect sent, your buyer's ready to walk away, and that you're really giving it to the seller at that point. It's not even
Okay.
just, we're asking you to fix this. Now it's everything.
Okay.
Now, if you don't want to do that, you don't have to. Maybe you just issue a notice of defect for the basement and that's it. And then it's
Okay.
really up to the seller to fix the basement or not. They can say no.
Okay, so out of everything in the report that you get back, the buyer will decide what they want the seller to
Hmm.
fix and what they're
Yep.
willing to put up with. Okay.
Yep. And I'll send you guys, we actually have a lot of contract trainings that specifically cover and focus in on the home inspection contingency. So that might be helpful information too for you guys
Okay.
to look over.
Okay.
Okay, David, you put, if a buyer doesn't give the seller a right to cure, a repair is still negotiable outside of a notice of defects, or is the only way to negotiate through a notice? No, so if you don't give the seller the right to cure, you can still try to negotiate with the other party, and you negotiate in the form of amendment, right? An amendment, both parties sign it. You can still try to ask the seller to do stuff, but you might not get a seller to be willing to do it, right? So if you didn't give the seller the right to cure, and if your buyer truly does not have the capability to fix the things that are in the home inspection and they just want to walk, now your buyer has every right to walk. Like when I bought my house in 2018, and it still was it was still a seller's market. But I don't know, my agent, he got me an offer accepted that didn't give the seller the right to cure. I couldn't, I looked at my offer a few years ago. I'm like, wow, that was interesting. But there were some electrical things that came up, and we negotiated that the seller fix the electrical issues that were outlined, and the seller was totally fine doing that. We signed an amendment, they fixed it, it was great. But we had lovely sellers that were willing to work with us. Okay, I'm gonna keep going here. Financing. So I have used a mortgage calculator to figure out some of these numbers here in the financing section. I use Carl's mortgage calculator, Carl with a K. You can also use, like, Focus Title has a great mortgage calculator. There's tons of mortgage calculators out there. But we know that Matt, our buyer, is gonna get a loan, so I've checked the box here. And in line 249, you put what type of loan your buyer's gonna get. So I put 30-year conventional. If they were getting a VA loan, an FHA loan, a 15-year, you would change the description in line 249. But I'm gonna have our loan commitment due within 21 days. So we know that our closing date is about 28 days. I like to try to give a week between financing and closing, a little bit of some breathing room. If you aren't quite sure how fast your buyer's lender can turn around an offer or a loan commitment letter, you should be calling your buyer's lender anyways when you're drafting the offer to let them know, hey, we're submitting this. And these are the dates and the terms that we're putting in, confirming that you can meet these. 21 days is pretty typical now. You can really get a loan commitment in 14 days, depending on the lender. Sometimes you can get them in 7, or even faster, but I've just put 21 days here for practice. And the amount that you're gonna be getting, that the buyer's gonna be getting financing for, is the amount you're gonna be putting in here in line 251. So if you remember, we're offering $477,500. Our buyer's putting 15% down. So this number represents the purchase price minus the down payment, which is called the principal. This is the loan, the amount that your buyer is gonna be getting a loan for. The term of the loan is gonna be for 30 years. It's gonna be amortized over 30 years, and the initial monthly payments of principal and interest shall not exceed. I got $2,700.30. So I got this number by taking our purchase price minus our down payment and figuring a monthly payment against a 7% interest rate over 30 years. So this is the number that the mortgage calculator gave me. Something to keep in mind when you're going through this with your buyers, they might see this amount and think, wow, that's a lot less than what I was budgeting. That's because this amount is only for the loan, the principal plus interest. It doesn't include taxes. It doesn't include homeowners insurance. This is just what the loan is going to be for. And if I go down here, we have to indicate what type of loan we're getting. So we're getting a fixed rate mortgage, meaning our interest rate is going to be the same percentage every single year for the 30 years of our loan. So I put 7% here. If you don't know what interest rates are going for, if you want to ask the lender, hey, what should I be putting in to the offer, by all means, please do. Usually I take a look at what current interest rates are and I give it a little bit of a cushion because they can fluctuate, week over week. But for practice today, we're going to put 7. And this language all right here talks about how a buyer satisfies that financing contingency and what needs to be done in order to deliver that loan commitment. So I'm not going to go through it in detail. Again, there's some other contract trainings that go through the financing section. I can send you guys after this. I'll send you some links to those. But this just indicates how the loan commitment gets sent and what happens if a buyer can't get the loan, or what happens if the deadline comes and no loan commitment letter has been delivered. In line 288, seller financing, our buyer's not getting a loan or getting any financial help from the seller. So I put NA, again, best practice, rather than leaving it blank, just put NA. If we were writing this as a cash offer, so not getting financing, we'd be filling this section out. But we're not cash, we are financing. So I'm just going to scroll right past. Our buyer wants to have the appraisal contingency included in the offer, so I've checked line 308. And so this means that the lender is going to have the property appraised, and it's going to be appraised at the buyer's expense by an independent appraiser. Now, the contingency is deemed satisfied unless buyer within blank days after acceptance delivers to the seller a copy of the appraisal report indicating that appraised value is less than the agreed purchase price and a notice objecting to the appraised value. So let's say we get an appraisal done and the appraiser comes back and says, house is appraised at $500,000. What do we do? We don't really have to do anything except tell the listing agent the appraisal value looks good. We're moving forward. Now, if say the appraiser comes in and the appraiser says this house is appraised at $470,000. Now remember, we're offering $477,500. So now we're finding out that the house that we want to buy is worth less than what we are offering. At that point, this appraisal contingency really specifies a lot more as to like how we can cure that difference. Now, I usually like to have the appraisal contingency due a few days before financing because the appraisal is going to be something that could influence your buyer's loan commitment. Now, if your buyer is going to want to ask the seller to cure, meaning to drop the price to meet the appraised value, you should really give the listing agent a copy of that appraisal report. You want to show them proof and that you're just not making it up, that the appraiser came in and said it's not worth what we're offering. You never should send the listing agent a copy of the appraisal report if the appraised value comes in higher than what you're buying it for. So here, I'm not going to go into many details here because we only have 9 more minutes, but you can give the seller the right to cure. So this is where you're trying to negotiate the difference. So if the seller has the right to cure, they can satisfy the contingency by delivering notice to the buyer, adjusting the purchase price to the value shown on the appraisal report within blank days after the buyer gives the appraisal report and a notice. If the seller agrees to dropping the price, both parties have to agree then to promptly execute an amendment, and it can be initiated by either party. The amendment has to reflect that you're adjusting the purchase price, right? You need to have an amendment in place and signed by both parties to make any adjustments to the price. Now, the offer is null and void if the buyer sends a notice objecting to that appraised value and the seller never had the right to cure to begin with. So the deal's dead. If your buyer doesn't have the money to make up the difference, or the deal is dead if the seller has the right to cure, but the seller's just not going to adjust the purchase price, or the seller doesn't get back to the buyer within the 2 days.
Can the seller still negotiate the price, or do they have to go down to the appraised price?
That's a good question. You can negotiate. It really depends on if the buyer has some extra cash on hand to make up the difference.
Okay.
There is an addendum AC, which we'll get to in a minute or two. There is a section in there that talks about an appraisal gap, and you can indicate that your buyer has some money to make up the difference.
Okay.
If your buyer had to sell a house before closing on this house that you're offering on, that's called a home sale contingency. You would check that box. We're not going to go through that section. Usually that's accompanied with a bump clause. If we were writing as a secondary offer, meaning the seller's already accepted another offer, but they're willing to accept others, you would know if you were writing as a secondary offer, you would be checking this box, but we're not going to go through that. We have to indicate how taxes and other types of assessments, expenses will be prorated between the two parties. You don't have to figure out or calculate those amounts. The title company will do that for both parties. But what you do have to indicate is how the title company should be prorating things. And usually we're checking box 366, meaning we're gonna take what the taxes were for the previous year and split them up. Now, if it's a new construction and there weren't any taxes, or maybe it was land and now there's a house on it, so the taxes are gonna be different. You've got some other options here to figure out how you would quantify and prorate some of those expenses. I would, if you're not quite sure which one to choose, pick up the phone, call the helpline, or call a compliance broker, and they can certainly help walk through that for you. But I'm not going to get into it today. Title, this talks about title and what title is and how a seller needs to provide a title that's free of any liens or judgments on the property. This is a bunch of definitions within the document, and I'm just going to keep on going down because we don't have much time. But then the other thing here that we need to make sure that we're going to fill out is that per the listing agent's direction, we can include the fact that the seller is going to pay the buyer's firm. So I've checked the box, and the seller was willing to pay 2.0% of the purchase price. So remember, we talked a little bit about what needs to happen because there's a gap between our agency agreement and what the seller is willing to pay. But make sure you check that box, fill in the amount. And again, if the listing agent would rather prefer or rather have you sign a compensation agreement before an offer is submitted, then you wouldn't be filling this out.
Okay.
Additional provisions here. This is something that is automatically added in my documents. It talks about if a deadline falls on a Monday or a Saturday or Sunday or a holiday, federal holiday, that the deadline is extended to the next business day. The only time that never happens is binding acceptance. That can happen 365 days a year. And then when I give the seller the right to cure a home inspection, I like to add this extra language here about how the seller needs to do that. And you can get this extra information by adding click add clause, go to the global library, and there's 22 different clauses that we've had our lawyer review that have legally approved or our lawyer approved language. So I hit the right to cure, and I literally just copied this and pasted it into the document. I've added here the addenda that we're attaching. So GMAR Addendum A, GMAR Addendum AC. I put my name here as the draftee, and that's the offer. I'm going to quickly go into Addendum A. The only thing I'm really checking the box on Addendum A is that we're attaching an Addendum S. So Addendum A is used for things like ordering a home warranty, if we are testing a well, testing well water, testing septic, if you're asking for seller credit. I'm not going to go through this because we are almost at time. But the only thing I'm checking off in this specific offer is that we're including the lead-based paint addendum. And then I have to put my information here as the buyer's firm. And then here on the right-hand side, I'm putting all the information for the listing agent and the seller, the listing office. And you can get all this information off of MLS. And then the last document that we're going to include is Addendum AC. And Addendum AC has 3 sections, and we're only going to use one of the 3 sections. So here I've put the date of our offer, our buyer's name, the address. But here I'm checking box 8, that our inspection contingency. So if you remember in our directions, we had indicated that our buyer was willing to pay for the first $1,000 worth of repairs. So that's what I'm stating here. Like the seller, we're not going to ask you for the first $1,000. Now, what also this contingency allows you to do is you can give the seller the chance to also get some estimates from contractors as well as the buyer. This also outlines how you come to an estimated cost. Say maybe the seller reached out to a basement company. They said it was going to be 20 grand. The buyer reached out to a basement company, and they said it was gonna be 15 grand. This actually says right here that they're going to be averaged. So again, we're giving the seller the chance to also get their own folks in there to give estimates. And then I've also checked the box here, indicating that either party can extend the deadline for the inspection contingency by blank days. This is kind of a buffer to give yourself more time to get those estimates or to more time to negotiate. But this doesn't automatically kick in. You must deliver notice indicating that we are going to leverage this and that we are going to extend the contingency by 5 days. I would probably sign an amendment to have both parties do it. And that's all that I'm going to be putting on this document. We're not using the appraisal gap, and we're not going to use the escalation clause. So I know I went through those fast. I will send you guys this information after, like the offer practice sheet again, and I'll send you some links to the contract trainings that talk about home inspection and the financing contingency. But if you want practice, I would highly encourage you guys to fill out your own offer, include it or download it as one PDF, and then send it to me as if I was the listing agent, and I'll give you guys feedback. So I hope you found it helpful.
Yes, thank you so much.
My pleasure. I'll see you guys soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.